there's studies that have been done that surveyed people in the company and asked them to report how much stress they felt. And people who were very low in the company and people who were very high and controlling the company at the top all reported the same amount of stress, the same levels of stress. However, the people lower in the company, their stress was due to things that were out of their control. So they had unpredictable work hours, had unpredictable pay, they had less job security, and those things resulted in poorer health outcomes for them, even though they had the same amount of stress of people higher in the company. And the people higher in the company had more control over their stress. They almost thrived on it, and they, had control over their income, and if they worked harder, they got paid more, like these types of things. And so they had less poor health outcomes. So the type of stress is very important. So if you look into your life trying to eliminate or mitigate stresses, try and eliminate the ones that make you feel like you're out of control or you're in an unpredictable situation or you don't know what the day-to-day is going to be like. Those are the important ones.
I am deeply honored today to have Dr. Hussey on the show to talk to us about heart health and how we can optimize our heart health. Dr. Hussey, welcome to the Charlène Gisèle Show.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
I'm delighted to have you here. I've been familiar with your work for a while, and I was thrilled when you accepted my invitation to be a guest. I would like to start off by giving you the floor and an opportunity to give us a little bit of a tour of your background, your connection to heart health, and perhaps a little bit of a story around how you became so passionate on the topic of heart health, please.
Yeah, definitely. So like my background, I guess my day job is I'm a chiropractor, and functional medicine practitioner. But I have, been dealing with, I guess, chronic illnesses, since I was 2 years old. So at a very young age, I had a lot of, I guess you'd call them inflammatory type conditions. I had asthma and allergies, irritable bowel syndrome. I used to break out in hives all over my body, just these huge giant hives that nobody could tell me where they came from. And then ultimately ended up with autoimmune type 1 diabetes, or at least autoimmunity is the theory. And so, my parents and I were very dependent on our doctors to tell us, why this is happening or what we can do about it. And, the advice I got was kind of suppress the symptoms or no real understanding of why they were there, why they were happening, but suppress the symptoms. And so, or like, there was no advice on lifestyle change when I was a kid and how that could impact things. And so I've always been almost like forced into this world of health, or disease. And, it wasn't until college that I started, figuring out that the way I lived my life or the things that I did day to day had an impact on these conditions. And I got rid of all of them aside from the type 1 diabetes, kind of collateral damage from that inflammation. And so all those inflammatory things are now gone. I no longer have asthma, no longer have allergic reactions to things, no longer have irritable bowel. And I thought that it was interesting that I never really received that advice from the doctors that I went to see. And so it became this lifelong passion or obsession of mine to kind of figure out the best way that I could live my life to keep these things gone or manage type 1 diabetes better than I had been told. And so that kind of, spawned my passion for health. And I majored in health and wellness in college, and then went on to chiropractic school and then got a master's in human nutrition and functional medicine. And yeah, it's just kind of been this thing, and all that formal education was great, but the real things I've learned have come outside of that. And in my own investigation, and looking at things that, I guess are different than what the mainstream way of thinking that the body works is. And I've gained lots of insights from that. And so, yeah, I changed a lot of different things from, my light environment to my food to, all different types of things, mental health and that kind of stuff. And then, despite some of my best efforts, I ended up 3 years ago actually having a heart attack. And I, was going through a period of a lot of stress at that time. And being type 1, I'm predisposed to that kind of thing. But I incorrectly or unwisely did a very intense workout the morning I had the heart attack. And I probably should not have done that in the state that I was in. I got some very distressing news about a day and a half before about a close family member. And it was the inability for anybody in my family to do anything for that person. We were just sitting around waiting, hoping that things were going to be okay. And yeah, I woke up Tuesday morning, did this intense workout, and 15 minutes later had a heart attack. And so that told me that I was missing something, something that I hadn't explored yet. And so the past 3 years since then, I've learned so much more because I dove even deeper into this, and the heart, and why it's actually there, what actually causes heart disease, these types of things. And it's very contrary to what I think that we're told when it comes to the true causes of heart disease. And so I'm trying to share the information that I've found and get people all the information, because when it comes to health, it's about making educated decisions. And if we don't have all the information, it's hard to do that. And so hopefully sharing my experience and the things that I've learned will help people make those better decisions.
And I'm so grateful you sharing such a deep story as well. And I know how personal that is, but I was wondering if perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about at which point did you realize that it was a heart attack, or was that after the event once the medical team intervened, or did you have a sense of what was going on? What did it feel like for you?
I mean, at first I was kind of like, well, what is this? But then it was very unmistakable to me, given that I have medical training. And I guess it was different for me than it was for some people. Because lots of times people will have, a pain or a pressure in their chest, but they'll also have pain down their arm, or sometimes up into their neck or things like that. And I didn't have that. I just had intense pressure pain right in the center of the left side of my chest. And so at first I was kind of like, I thought it was just like my pec muscle was tightening up from the workout I just did. I was just like, that's weird, but it intensified and wouldn't go away. And I was just like, I think that this is something more. And I was by myself. I called the ambulance myself, and it just continued to intensify. And it was, by the time I was in the ambulance, it was the worst pain I've ever had in my life. It was very intense. But I got to the hospital within an hour and a half, and they diagnosed it based on the EKG, and they sent me right to the cath lab, and they busted the clot and put in a stent. And thankful for that team. They worked very efficiently, and they saved me, because they say like it was a widowmaker. It was the left anterior descending artery, and they I think the stat is like 12% of people who have those outside of the hospital survive. So I'm part of that 12, I guess. So the odds weren't great, but I like to think that the things that I have done to take care of myself, things that I've changed in my lifestyle, made it so that I was able to survive that as well as I did. And if I hadn't been doing those things, if I had been poor health at that time, then maybe I wouldn't have. But yeah, so it was very interesting, and it was kind of a mystery. I mean, they went in there, and, the theory is that there's stenosis of an artery or narrowing of an artery in the heart, and that eventually causes a clot to rupture, and then you get this heart attack. And I found evidence that that's not true, and that definitely wasn't true in my case, because they went in and they found no atherosclerosis except for this giant clot that formed, is how they described it to me, in the left anterior descending artery. And I had a CAC score done 6 months prior to this, which a CAC score is a measurement of the amount of calcified plaque in your arteries, which doesn't tell you about soft plaque. It tells you about hard, quote unquote, more stable plaque. But mine was 0. I had no calcification of any plaque, no stenosis or narrowing, according to that particular test, in my arteries. Yet 6 months later, I have this clotting event that happens in the heart. So yeah, it's very interesting. They were a little perplexed, I guess. And all they wanted to do was blame my cholesterol. They were just like, oh yeah, cholesterol, even though my cholesterol numbers were, in their terms, quote unquote, normal, or maybe a little above normal, but that was it. And we can talk about cholesterol if you want, as far as, the I guess misplaced theory that that's the driver of heart disease. But yeah. So, it was interesting.
Mm-hmm. Please, by all means, I would love to dive into that cholesterol conversation, because I think there is a lot of myth around it and a lot of misinformation and misguidance. And it would be really useful for our audience to get your insights and input on that.
Yeah. So for a very long time, there's been this idea that cholesterol, or lipoproteins, LDL, or total cholesterol in the blood, is what causes heart disease, that it, gets stuck on the lining of the artery and causes this plaque to form. And there's really just no evidence behind that, besides some associational studies, that say, oh yeah, there's an association between higher cholesterol and more rates of heart disease and things like that. But there's also a bunch of associational studies that show that the higher your cholesterol is, the higher cognitive abilities you have, and the lower cancer rates, and the lower rates of heart disease, and the lower rates of infection, and the lower rates of all-cause mortality from anything, the higher your cholesterol is. So these associational studies are not something that we can, put too much stock in. And so the theory, the history of this is really important to understand. So in after World War II, heart disease, I guess, started to rise, because prior to that, in like the early 1900s, heart disease was not really a major thing. It wasn't an epidemic that we have today. And the field of cardiology was kind of small. There was a few doctors that were interested in the heart and things like that. But other than that, it was a pretty small subset of physicians. And now we have this whole American College of Cardiology and all this stuff, because heart disease after World War II started to rise. And famously, President Eisenhower had a heart attack while in the Oval Office. And so the country was kind of like, what is this new disease? What is this? And there was this fear. And so there was this big push to, create a theory as to why this was happening. And so this researcher named Ansel Keys, at University of Minnesota, he came up with a theory, and he did what he called his 6-country study. And then later he followed it up with a 7-country study. And basically all he did was look at the associations of the amounts of cholesterol and saturated fat that a country ate and their rates of heart disease. And he basically found this correlation to how much saturated fat and cholesterol that a country ate, based on data. And he linked it to the rates of heart disease, and he saw this correlation. However, he only used the data from the 7 countries that gave him the correlation that he wanted, even though there was data from 22 countries available at the time. So he kind of cherry picked the data, and this is very well documented and established, that this is what he did. And so they actually heavily tested this theory. So after the idea that the theory kind of went off, and there was that, Time magazine where there was a frowny face with bacon on the cover of it. After this theory had kind of already taken off, they heavily tested it in the 60s and the 70s. And it's probably one of the most heavily tested nutrition theories ever. There was 6 or 7 different studies that were very expensive and very hard to do, because nutrition studies our research is hard to do. But what they found is that the more that they replaced cholesterol and saturated fat in people's diets and replaced it with unsaturated fat, the more heart disease these people had. And so in all these studies, that's what they all showed. But the theory had already taken off, and there was a lot of money behind it. There was a lot of money from the food industry that wanted to, this idea that saturated fat was bad, was beneficial for their products of grains and sugars and vegetable oils and things like that. So there was a lot of money behind it, and the theory kind of took off. And it's been the theory since then. And so actually some of these studies, and this is, again, very well documented, some of these studies that shows that replacing saturated fat and cholesterol with unsaturated fat cause more heart disease. They were kind of, first of all, they weren't published right away. There's one of them that wasn't published until 16 years later. And it was published in a journal, a small journal rather than a big journal. These researchers had some clout. They could have published in the Lancet and BMJ and all these different big journals, but they published it in small journals, where not many people read them. And they also admitted data. And there's a researcher named Christopher Ramsden that has dug this up and figured this out. And so this theory has kind of stuck. And it's kind of been the mainstream of that cholesterol causes heart disease. And so, the way that you prevent that is you keep your cholesterol low. And that's what statin drugs do. And PCSK9 inhibitors. And now there's even new types of drugs that'll prevent absorption in the colon or in the large intestine. So there's lots of different ways that they're trying to lower the cholesterol, but the end result is an epidemic of disease that continues to rise. Statin drugs are the number 1, number 2 prescribed drug, at least in America, every year. So if they were working so well, then you'd think that heart disease rates would go down, but they're not. So that right there just calls that into question. And if you look at, the research, especially research coming out very recently, basically what cholesterol tells us is about our metabolism. It doesn't tell us about risk of a disease. And there's no situation where cholesterol says, you know what, I'm just going to embed myself into the lining of the artery today. Because that's what I do, because it's not what it does. LDL particles are there to deliver energy in the form of fats, cholesterol, which is what animals use. Phytosterol is what plants use. And so we are animals, we use cholesterol. So if we're burning more fat for fuel, like if you go low carb and you're generally healthy, then your LDL may go up and your total cholesterol may go up because you're metabolizing more fats, which is what your body is trying to do, deliver those fats to the body. And if you eat more carbohydrates, the cholesterol will go down. And so if you look at a population that is eating a ton of carbohydrates, which is processed food diet of standard American diet, then of course, what looks normal when you measure cholesterol is when everyone's eating those high carbohydrates is this lower cholesterol. That's what's been deemed as normal. But all cholesterol levels in the blood can tell you is about what your body's metabolizing at the time. And there's very interesting work being done by Nick Norwitz at Harvard showing that, and Dave Feldman with lean mass hyperresponder groups and different studies that they've done. And there's other research, William Cromwell and Matthew Budoff and different researchers who are showing that that's exactly what's happening. Like we're only measuring someone's metabolism through cholesterol. We're not measuring risk of anything else. So yeah, there's this whole story and this whole thing. And there's even, even from the Journal of American College of Cardiology, there was a study that was like recently that said that, looking at all the evidence, the theory about saturated fat and cholesterol has been overblown. And it's actually, they've shown with saturated fat intake, it's actually protective against stroke. So yeah, lots of this theory is kind of taken off and we've been kind of stuck in it for a while, but it's starting to come around and the evidence is starting to come out that it's not the driver of heart disease. And it's been a big distraction, in my opinion, to the actual causes of heart disease, which is what I've kind of put my efforts into finding out.
Dr. Hussey, you just mentioned your passion about uncovering the actual drivers and causes of heart disease. Could you tell us a little bit more about that now that we know how you feel about what could be some red herrings around what are drivers and causes? Could you tell us about what you think in your experience and life experience, but also medical background, are the true drivers and causes of heart disease?
Yeah. So just like in my case, when a giant clot formed, and that was a very acute situation where a clot formed that was big enough to block a whole artery. If you look at what atherosclerosis is, which is, this plaque formation on an artery anywhere, whether it's a coronary artery or anywhere else, it's clotting tissue. And there's a few different studies that I found that when they, took the clotting tissue, the atherosclerosis out of someone and analyzed it on autopsy, it was a very large percentage fibrotic clotting tissue, not an accumulation of cholesterol. There was some cholesterol present, but it was, no more than enough that kind of gets sucked into the clot whenever a clot forms. And there is evidence that cholesterol plays a role in, like, when there's damage to the lining of an artery, it plays a role in the healing. So it gets involved in that way, but it's not this driver of atherosclerosis. And so clotting tissue, like, what is clotting tissue? And so, people can think of it as like you cut your skin and a clot forms and a scab forms. That's clotting tissue that stops bleeding. And so why would clotting tissue form on the lining of an artery? Because the artery gets damaged. If the artery gets damaged enough, then and it's like overwhelmed and it can't heal itself, because it's supposed to be able to heal itself, because there's a normal amount of wear and tear that's supposed to happen in arteries. But it's supposed to be able to heal itself pretty well, endothelial cells, which line the artery. And if it can't, because we're insulin resistant, like type 2 diabetic, or there's so much damage that it causes an acute situation where there's acute damage, or the damage is chronically overwhelming to the system and it can't heal itself, then we can get this repair mechanism, which is clotting tissue. The body has to stop that artery from being damaged, or the artery could break or rupture or start to bleed, and so that's what the body does. It deposits this clotting tissue on the lining of the artery to stop that from happening. And this clotting tissue is not like normal tissue, so it doesn't function like endothelial cells, but it can grow. And it can grow over time and make, the lumen of an artery, the middle of an artery, gets smaller and smaller over time, right? Now, there are, and lots of people disagree with me on this, but there's some, cardiovascular researchers and physicians that have read my book and actually do agree with me, and said that they, a lot of things that they see clinically make sense based on what my book says. But, the idea is that this, like in the coronary arteries, that this narrowing of the artery gets more and more, and eventually it closes off, or it becomes so narrow that not enough blood can get through, and that can cause angina, or a part of that plaque can break off and rupture, and then cause a clot to form. And that does happen, it does rupture. But there's a very fascinating paper from 2015 that looked at all the evidence of this plaque rupture theory. And they say that, plaque ruptures do happen, but very rarely do they cause a heart attack. They rupture, and then it kind of heals on top of that, forms this cap, and that continues to close the artery off and create a narrower and narrower space. And it's all this clotting tissue. It's all because there's inflammation and damage, and there's this clotting tissue happening. And that's what causes the rupture. But there's also work of a researcher named Giorgio Beraldi. And he found, doing autopsies of people who had heart attacks, who didn't have heart attacks, and throughout his career, he's the guy who developed. Have you ever been to like those Body World exhibits, or the Animal Inside Out exhibits, where they have all these unique dissections of things? Mm-hmm. Well, there's some of those things where like they've put like a plastic material into the arterial system of a fish, and so you get the whole arterial system of the fish there. That's really cool looking. He's the one who developed that technique. And so he did these on hearts, and he found that anywhere that there was a 60 to 70% narrowing of an artery of the heart, the body built a vast network of collaterals around that totally bypassed it. And sometimes they were robust enough that the person could, run a marathon. And there's actually evidence of people with 90% blockages in their heart running a marathon. But sometimes it was just enough to keep the person alive. And so because the body does this, this is why when you do elective stent procedures, like when they go in and they say, oh, you've got a 50% stenosis, we're going to put a stent there, or bypass surgeries, if you look at the long-term studies on those, and I can't find one that says they're successful, they don't work. They don't prevent future heart attacks, which is the outcome they're trying to prevent. Like whether you have the procedure or don't, you're just as likely to have a heart attack, because these lesions, these stenosis of arteries, is not where heart attacks occur. Heart attacks occur when there's acute clotting, just like in my situation. It happened with me with no stenosis, but it can happen with someone with a stenosis. It's just when the body clots. So the question becomes, what creates clotting tissue? What makes clotting tissue form in an artery? And Rudolf Virchow, back in 1850 something, I think, he determined this, and he found out what this was. And it's still true in medicine today. It's still accepted today that Virchow's triad, these things that happen in arteries, are what cause clotting. And those three things are damage to the lining of the artery, poor blood flow or changes in blood flow, and when elements of blood, like red blood cells or lipoproteins or anything in there, clump together. So when those things happen, when things clump together, when the blood starts to slow, when we get damage, that can lead to clotting. So then the question is, what causes those things? And there's a very new, well, it's not very new, but it become newly popular to talk about is water. Water in the body. We are made up of water, and water actually has very unique properties in our body. It's able to structure itself, so to speak. And this means that there's a fourth phase of water. It's not solid, not liquid. This fourth phase is more like a gel. It's kind of between ice and water. And most of the water in our bodies is in this state. And if people think this is crazy, all you got to do is touch your forearm and see that the tissue gives, and it feels like a gel. It feels like Jell-O, right? Because it gives and it bounces right back. So most of the water in my body is in this gel-like state. Think like Jell-O, or like the consistency of a raw egg white, that kind of gel. Okay. And so, but there's places where water in the body is liquid, the blood being one of them, the cerebral spinal fluid, the lymphatic fluid. However, some of that blood or some of that water in the blood can structure itself onto biological surfaces, which all biological surfaces are water loving, and that water can structure itself onto these. And when I say structure itself, it just means that there's a layer of gel that forms on the lining of the artery. And the reason that that's important is twofold. One is because researchers, this is coming out of the lab of Gerald Pollack at University of Washington. Researchers have shown that this water is also called exclusion zone water because nothing can penetrate it. No natural biological thing can penetrate it. It's this exclusion zone where it excludes everything that's not it, aside from very small minerals. Some small minerals, hydrated minerals, can penetrate it, but that's it, like potassium. So in that sense, it protects the lining of the artery from things that may damage it. So there's Virchow's triad number one. We protect the artery with structured water. Secondly, Dr. Pollack's lab has also shown that because of the way this water forms, and we don't have to get into like the biochemistry of it, but like because of the way that it forms, it actually is what makes blood move. So this, the structured water is very electronegative, and the hydrogens that are next to it are very positive, and that's a positive next to a negative, and that creates a battery. They've actually shown that you can put two electrodes into the positive area, into the negative area when structured water forms, and light a light bulb. So it creates energy, and that energy moves blood. And they've shown this over and over again in Dr. Pollack's lab. They've shown it in animals that the blood continues to move after the heart stops beating if they build structured water onto the arteries. And so that's Virchow's triad number two, keep blood moving so that things don't clot. And then the third thing is that structured water not only forms on the lining of the artery, it also forms on the elements of the blood, the red blood cells, the lipoproteins, and there's plenty of evidence that this indeed does happen. And what that means is that since structured water is very negatively charged, it gives these molecules a negative charge. And like charges repel each other. So if this thing holds this negative charge, they don't stick together. They stay very evenly spaced and away from each other, which is Virchow's triad number two, keep things from clumping up. And so this ability to structure water in our bodies is how we prevent clotting. We prevent situations where the hemodynamics and the biophysics of the body break down and clotting happens, or is more likely to happen, I'd say. And so then the question is, what builds structured water and what breaks it down, right? And so there are many things that have been associated with higher rates of atherosclerosis that also interfere with structured water's ability to form. One of them is just toxin exposure, different toxins, whether it's heavy metals or endotoxemia from poor dental health or poor gut health, things like that, plastics, different toxins have been shown to increase rates of atherosclerosis the more we're exposed to them, and sometimes in human models, sometimes in animal models. And so that's one thing. Another thing that interferes with structured water formation is, one toxin in particular, glyphosate, which is the herbicide Roundup. So you can go pick that up at Lowe's if you wanted to, but I advise against it. But but that, and then also electromagnetic fields, like non-native electromagnetic fields. So Wi-Fi and cell phones and just any wireless technology. These are non-native to us. The only native electromagnetic field is that of the Earth or other living things. And they've shown in Dr. Pollack's lab that a wireless router decreases structured water formation 15 to 20%. So this is, very established research that this does happen. So there's that stuff. And then, so those are the things that can break it down. And then the other thing that can break it down is not being in an environment that builds it up, right? And so in Dr. Pollack's lab, the environmental stimulus that builds structured water the most in your arteries is radiant energy, mostly in the form of infrared light, far infrared light being the best, a 3,000 nanometer wavelength. And so this makes sense because 42% of the sun's rays are infrared light. And so being in that light, which all life on the planet has been in that light ever since life, came about, has been in that light. So that's what we can use. And if you look at the research on infrared sauna use and vascular health, it's phenomenal. Like just study after study after study, mostly in Japan. They study that a lot in Japan. So you can use infrared sauna and it heals the lining of the artery and it helps endothelial cells function better because we're building up that structured water, which protects the arteries and also keeps blood moving. So if you look at the studies on infrared sauna and heart failure, they're also pretty phenomenal. People literally, it seems, reverse heart failure when they use infrared sauna in some of these studies, which is pretty fascinating and pretty powerful. And it all makes sense when we think about these mechanisms of how the vascular system actually works. So yeah. And then the other thing that you can do to increase structured water is grounding. So putting your feet directly on the earth, which a lot of people think is kind of woo-woo, but like all life on earth is connected to the ground. Most of the time that humans have been here, we've been connected to the earth. It's only been recently that we've, since probably Industrial Revolution, that we were out of contact in large quantities away from the earth. And so they've actually shown that you can conduct electrons from the earth because two conductive surfaces will conduct electrons between themselves. And the area of higher energy is always going to conduct into the area of lower energy. And I'm never going to have as many electrons as the earth does. So it'll always flow into me. And they've actually shown that grounding will increase the structured water formation on the elements of blood, keeping them evenly spaced. There's fascinating studies that show that like before and after, the red blood cells are nice and evenly spaced and moving through the blood cohesively, but not clumped together. So yeah, super interesting things to think about. But again, it all makes sense. Like all life is designed to absorb energy from the environment. And we do that by absorbing electrons, and we do that in various ways. We can take the sun and make electrons directly from it. We can also soak it up from the earth. So we can also get some electrons from food, which is what we do. Anybody who studies cellular physiology knows that the mitochondria have an electron transport chain. And so we can harvest those, the energy and the chemical bonds of food and create electrons and pass them down this chain to make ATP. Like this is how physiology works, but we can get those electrons from other places as well. So it all kind of makes sense. And the reason that we see vascular disease more prevalently is because if we have this, low body charge of low electrons into the body, then the vascular system and the gut are kind of the front line of defense. So they take the hit, which is why we have this epidemic of poor gut health and cardiovascular disease and things like that. So that was kind of a lot, but hopefully people got it. But that's what's causing heart disease. It's not cholesterol.
Good to know. And when it comes to someone wanting to optimize their health, arteries, and really take that journey further and deeper, would you say there are different recommendations for someone I would describe as wanting to prevent a cardiovascular vascular incidents. So someone who's looking for prevention, someone who's looking for longevity, someone who's looking to live a long life with a very healthy heart, versus someone who has had a heart attack or a cardiovascular incident. Would the recommendation be different as a prevention or post first heart attack?
No, I mean, I think things would generally be the same. The recommendations would generally be the same. There may be a few differences, and that for someone like me, for a while, since I had this foreign body in me, I took a blood thinner because there's this foreign body that I don't know how my body's going to respond to. So I did that for a while. But yeah, and then also for someone like me who's type 1 diabetic and whose blood sugars are never going to be as stable as someone who's non-type 1 diabetic, then I guess it's more important for someone like me to be doing these things that reduce the risk of clotting. And that is the key, is that you have to do things, put your body in an environment that reduces the risk of clotting, which is building the structured water in your vascular system, and just your body in general. And so, we discussed what those things were. But I think that another component of this, and something that has been shown unequivocally to cause damage to the lining of the artery, but also increase clotting risk, is chronic stress. So when we are in, and it makes sense, like evolutionarily, if we were exposed to a stress, our body would increase, clotting factors, preparing the clot, because the stress usually meant that we were under attack by something. And so if we were under attack, there's a likelihood we would get an injury. So your body is preparing to clot, if that, to save you from bleeding from that injury. And so under this stress, we have this increase in clotting factors. But there's also, in chronic stress, there's damage to the lining of the artery, which is one of the things that can increase risk of clotting too. And so, and it's today, Robert Sapolsky at Stanford talks about this a lot. He talks about how, we have this, like human brains are so big, and that's great. It's gotten us so far in the animal world. We've kind of, separated ourselves from the animal world because we have these big brains. However, we're the only species that can think our way into a stress response. Or we can see something stressful happen to somebody else halfway across the world and fear it's going to happen to us. Or we can have something stressful happen to us, and instead of having a stress response and return to normal, we think about that thing all day long. And there's all these, I guess I could say, unnatural stressors of the modern world. Lots of them are some of the things we've talked about as far as modern day environments, stimuli, electromagnetic fields and whatever. So those things can, increase or decrease our body's ability to handle the stress. But this chronic stress is definitely, been seen to, be associated, again, associational study with higher rates of heart disease, and has been shown to be triggering of events, right? Because if we're in this state where things are inflamed, we have low structured water, clotting risk is elevated, and then we have this acute stress, and it promotes all these clotting factors like that, then it's very likely that stress could trigger that heart attack, which is, I think, what happened with me. I was in this state of stress, and then I did this thing that's kind of inflammatory. I did this very intense workout, and it happened. So yeah. But yeah, so I think that a very important thing to talk about when it comes to how you help your body deal with stress, well, there's two things. One is the type of stress is very important. There's studies that have been done that show that, like, people within a company, they surveyed people in the company and asked them to report how much stress they felt. And people who were very low in the company, and people who were very high and controlling the company at the top, all reported the same amount of stress, the same levels of stress. However, the people lower in the company, their stress was due to things that were out of their control. So they had unpredictable work hours, had unpredictable pay, they had less job security, things like that. And those things resulted in poor health outcomes for them, even though they had the same amount of stress of people higher in the company. And the people higher in the company had more control over their stress. They almost thrived on it. And they, had control over their income and if they worked harder, they got paid more, like these types of things, like they had more control of it. And so they had less poor health outcomes. So the type of stress is very important. So if you look into your life trying to eliminate or mitigate stresses, trying to eliminate the ones that make you feel like you're out of control, or you're in an unpredictable situation, or you don't know what the day-to-day is going to be like. Those are the important ones. And then secondly, your body wants to know where it is and what time it is. And so that's very important for our physiology to know that. So you can think about it like, if you've ever woken up in the middle of the night or in the morning and you momentarily forgot what day it was or where you were or whatever, and it takes about 10 seconds before you orient yourself, and you're like, but those 10 seconds are pretty stressful because you don't know where you are, you don't know what time it is, and you have to kind of reorient yourself. And so your body feels that kind of stress when it doesn't know what time it is or where it is on the earth, and things like that. And so the further we remove ourselves from those things that tell your body that, the more decreased our ability to handle stress will be, because the body just feels disoriented. And so the things that tell your body where it is are when you have direct contact with the earth. So we're back to that grounding thing. And then also the light, the sunlight, or where the sun is what tells your body what time it is. Light in the eye, your light is a clock, not just a camera. And so when your circadian rhythm is disrupted because we're getting light at the wrong times, it can confuse your body as to what time it is. And that's not only confusing for the nervous system as far as how to deal with the stress, but it also is very confusing for when to do certain things, like produce all your hormones that regulate day in and day out, when your body is supposed to do what. So the main issue with that today is that we have modern indoor lighting that when the sun goes down, we turn on. And so blue light is what tells your body what time it is. So when the sun rises, when it comes over the horizon, blue light spikes, and that tells your body it's daytime, wake up. Cortisol spikes, that tells your body to wake up. And then when the sun goes down, blue light goes away, and that tells your body that it's nighttime. And that cortisol stops being produced, and you start to prepare yourself for sleeping. We make melatonin. And if you have these blue lights on, because all these modern LEDs and fluorescent bulbs are primarily blue or green light, then they're telling your body that it's noon. And so then you don't get melatonin production. And so then you don't prepare for sleep. And then not only do you may have trouble sleeping, so people get insomnia this way, you also don't get that deep restorative. Even if you fall asleep like you're unconscious, you don't get the deep restorative sleep that your body needs, where it cleans house at night. Okay. Because your body needs to do that every single night. It needs to kind of clean house and drain the lymphatic system and drain the lymphatic system and detoxify, do mitophagy and autophagy, which is just where your body decides if cells are too old and things, and it just kills off the old ones and makes new ones, healthy ones. Like that needs to happen every night. And if we're suppressing the production of melatonin with blue light after sunset, then that doesn't happen. And that's a huge issue. And if you just go into the research and type in disrupted circadian rhythm and whatever disease you want, and there's research on it, that this light environment is affecting our health in negative ways. And so, some of the easiest things to do are get a pair of blue light blocking glasses, and when the sun goes down, you put them on. Or you could use light bulbs, like incandescent bulbs or red light bulbs after sunset. Limit your screen time, because the screens are definitely affecting things. Or like, even if you can like turn the blue light down on the screens of your phone and the computer, and wear the glasses too, because it doesn't mean all blue light is gone, and any blue light will tell your body that the sun's out. So it's a huge issue. Just like processed food is bad for us, processed light is also bad for us, and processed light at the wrong time is very bad for us.
It is. And I'm really glad that you've touched upon the topic of stress response and chronic stresses, because that's definitely something that is on the rise with high performing professions and just generally life pressures. And I was wondering if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about how to monitor our stress response. And specifically what I have in mind is perhaps could we delve into the relevance of monitoring HRV when it comes to heart health and your take on it, and what are things that you would recommend our listeners could do to optimize their HRV?
Yeah. So heart rate variability is not heart rate. It's heart rate variability. So like there's supposed to be a little variation between heartbeats. It's not this steady thing that just, ticks the same interval each time. It's supposed to vary a little bit. And that variation, so think of it like this, like heart rate variability is really measuring, people think it's measuring like balance in the autonomic nervous system, which is kind of how we cope with stress, but really it's measuring what's called coherence. And so coherence is just the ability of all elements of your body, all cells in your body to be synced up and communicating to each other so that they can handle a stress. Well, if they encounter a stress, then everything's communicating to handle it. So you can think of it like a company. Like if there's 30 employees in a company, and the company is all the employees are not communicating well. There's some tension in the company, or there's this hierarchy that's not being managed well, or whatever. And people are like, maybe the compensation is based on competition rather than working collectively together. And what that creates is a situation where there's low coherence. Things are not communicating. And if that company encounters a stress for whatever reason, then it's much less likely that that company is going to be able to handle that stress and come out the other side dealing with it okay and still a company, right? Whereas if we create this cohesive team where everybody's communicating, everybody's on the same page, and they're all individually doing their job to do what's best for the company as a whole, and they feel this sense of community, then that company encounters a stress and they're going to handle it no problem. And they're going to get through it and come out the other side, maybe even stronger. So that's what coherence is. And so our body has this, it needs to communicate with itself. And that's what HRV is measuring, this heart rate variability. And the reason that the beats are kind of offset, or like they're not the same beat every time, it's kind of like, I liken it to like an athletic stance. Like when you're in an athletic stance, you're ready for something to happen, right? So you're bouncing back and forth. You're getting ready. You're on your toes, right? Whereas if you're just standing flat-footed and it was the same beat each and every time, you're not prepared for what's going to happen in that athletic game, So that's why the heart needs to have this heart rate variability, this variability between heartbeats, so that you're ready for this. It shows a measure of how ready you are to handle a stress. And deal with that stress and then come back to homeostasis. And so like heart rate variability, like if people, just took their pulse on their wrist, like you just sit there and you kind of calmly sit there and you just take a deep breath in, then that's, and you feel the pulse quicken a little bit. And then when you breathe out, you'll feel the pulse slow. And the difference between the fastest the heartbeat gets when you breathe in and the slowest it gets when you breathe out is it's something called respiratory sinus arrhythmia. It's the difference between those things. And that's the same, it's measuring the same thing as heart rate variability. But it's just to get a sense of like that variation between heartbeats, basically just when you breathe, right? And so that's what heart rate variability is measuring. And so there's different devices that people can get to measure their heart rate variability, which is basically measuring how coherent they are and able to handle stress and return to homeostasis. And so there's the Aura Ring, there's Elite HRV, there's like they have them on the Apple Watches and things like that. So different things you can get to measure HRV. And, they say that anywhere from 20 to 100 is normal. And so what you want to do is kind of, when you measure heart rate variability, you want to get your baseline. So you measure it for a week or two and you get what your baseline is. So then because otherwise you don't have anything to compare it to. And so then, you can see day to day, or if you're going through a stressful time or you do start a new health activity, you can see if it affects heart rate variability. And you can see if it's a positive or negative change, depending on what's going on in your life. And then, things that have been shown to improve heart rate variability, and there are many, many things, are things like grounding, or optimizing your circadian rhythm, syncing your body up to the day-night cycle, infrared sauna. So going back to all these things that we've already discussed. So it's all kind of coming together. Just getting sunlight in general increases it. Also, the more positive, loving social relationships that somebody has, um, the higher the heart rate variability tends to be. And then there's little hacks and things people can do, like plunging your face into cold water will do it, or cold plunges in general have been shown to do that. There's lots of different things that have been shown to increase heart rate variability. But generally, they all point toward a more move back to nature, back to the stimuli that life has been in since life has been around, and away from, or at least mitigating the things that our modern world demands of us, like the unnatural light, and to be constantly connected through wireless technology, or to have maybe more, dare I say, like superficial, artificial relationships rather than real, meaningful, caring relationships. Like this technology has brought us together. It makes this podcast possible, but, we also want to make sure that we have a group of people that have real, like as many acquaintances that we have and business connections that we have, how many real supportive relationships do we have to fall back on when we need them too? Like that's really important. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, I could go on and on about things that increase heart rate variability, but yeah.
I'm fascinated about that topic, and from a personal and experimental standpoint, I've noticed that simple things like gratitude practice, really bringing it down to basic and just actually taking 1 to 3 minutes to really rehearse mentally the things that I feel deeply grateful for, but even more specifically going a layer deeper and thinking about a story. I like to frame it with a story so that there is a narrative. That makes the gratitude very powerful. And also spending time in nature or surrounding myself with green or blue colors and or natural sounds. I find that very, very soothing and very good to optimize HRV. What's your take on those very holistic natural tools?
Yeah, definitely. So, and this is what they've shown at the Heart Math Institute with Dr. Roland McCready. They've been looking at this for years, and they found that expressing love and gratitude create coherence and increase heart rate variability, and that expressing this is having, don't think of it as like expressing it in an acute situation, even though that's helpful. Like think about it, having a grateful and loving attitude all the time is what creates the coherence. Whereas having a resentful or angry attitude all the time, that creates incoherence and poor heart rate variability. So the very opposite. So yeah, like that's what they've shown directly. There's 6 different like emotions you can express or have a general attitude about that have been shown to affect them. But the ones that some of them, are more producing coherence, some are producing more incoherence. But those are the polar opposite ones: was love and gratitude, anger and resentment. So those are the things we want to be conscious of. It's not that you should never express anger. Like that happens sometimes, and you don't want to hold that in. Like expressing emotions can be therapeutic, but you want to make sure that you don't get stuck in an angry or resentful attitude all the time, and you're seeing everything in that light. You want to be, practicing, like you said, practicing gratitude, and consciously trying to do it. Like even if like every morning, one of my routines is, I write down things that I'm grateful for, even if it ends up being the same things every day or generally the same things. Or some things are always the same, and then I have things that I was thankful for about the day before, or that I'm looking forward to today. I write those things down, and I like that idea about having like some kind of narrative or story to it. Just like, when you're reading something, it's way easier to read something when there's a story and you wanna figure out the end of the story. So, but then nature too, like just nature sounds, natural light, being in touch with the earth, like all this stuff has been shown to increase heart rate variability for sure.
And Dr. Hussey, can we go a little bit more granular into your heart health routine? So the things that you do very intentionally to continue to optimize your heart health after your heart attack.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what I do every morning. So I wake up in time to see the sunrise, which is different throughout the year and depending on where you live. So this morning it was 6:54. And so I get out there. And if I wake up before the sun rises, because sometimes I have to, days when I work, I have to, then I'm wearing the blue blocker glasses because I want the first light that I see not to be a screen or a indoor light or anything. I keep the lights very low in the house. I use incandescent bulbs, and then I don't take them off until I've seen the sunrise. But yeah, so I wake up and then I do like a 20-minute yoga, like stretching routine. And then I eat first thing because I think it's very important to eat when cortisol spikes and not eat late at night. They've actually done studies that they didn't even change what people ate. They just change when they ate, which I think what you eat is still important. But they just changed when they ate, and they lost weight. Their cardiometabolic risk factors came down just by eating, not eating, 4 hours before, within the 4 hour window before bedtime. So just eat closer to when it's light out. So I eat first thing in the morning. I drink 2 cups of water with electrolytes first, and then I eat high protein, animal protein. So I have some sardines and eggs in the morning, and then I go back upstairs and I do the gratitude journal, and then I sit in my sauna for 15, 20 minutes, depending on the season, and then take a shower. And I always turn the water on cold the last 2 to 3 minutes of the shower, and just stand there and get kind of accustomed to the cold, especially in the winter. I think it's important for our bodies to be acclimatized to the season that we're in, and there's very good mitochondrial benefits from that. And then, yeah, that's my morning routine, and then I go to work. So yeah, and then I try and get sunlight throughout the day at various times of the day. UVA rise, which is mid-morning, different time depending on where you live and what time of year it is. UVA triggers your body to do a lot of things, and UVA is when the sun is like 10 degrees above the horizon. There's an app called Circadian that will help you figure out when that is. And then I try and get, even in the winter, like if it's a sunny day, I'm out there getting sunlight around midday, and then I block blue light in the evening. I'm at the clinic for 3-4 hours in the morning, 3-4 hours in the evening, and I block blue light after that. And I eat my second meal around 2:00. Right before I go back to work for the afternoon. And then I kind of keep things low key in the evening, like I'll read or watch something informational or something like that, but I don't do anything like a stream. No crazy conversations or crazy movies or things that work me up. I try and calm things, keep the lighting low, and wear my boot blockers, and just prepare myself for bed. And that's kind of my day in, day out. So, yeah.
Thanks for sharing. I was curious as well, and I hope you don't mind me asking, but because you mentioned that your heart attack happened very closely after a strenuous workout, where do you stand on strenuous workout and endurance or ultra endurance even? And the reason I'm asking is because I know a lot of our listeners are avid marathon runners and Ironman, and I was just wondering whether you have a take on that and whether or not there are some potential things to bear in mind in terms of heart health and strenuous or endurance sports.
Yeah. So I write about this in my book a lot. I'm actually not a fan of endurance, especially ultra endurance exercise. I'm not going to take it away from anybody if they just absolutely love it and they want to do it. But there's lots of evidence that people who have run more marathons or done this extreme endurance exercise have more atherosclerosis and scarring of their heart tissue later in life. And so, like I said, like if you get some kind of mental benefit from it, or you just like it or something, I'm never going to, or it's like your job, or you get some part of your career, some people are athletes that get paid to do that, then I'm not going to take it away from you. I'm not going to tell you that it's going to kill you or anything, because obviously people do it a lot. Although there is evidence of people running marathons and having heart attacks. You don't need to do it. The average person does not need to do that to be healthy. And I think that that's the take home. That amount of strenuous exercise is damaging to the lining of the artery. That's what it seems to be long term. If you want to stay fit, like you don't, unless you're an athlete and have to train for a specific level of activity and meet these certain goals, and peaks at certain times and certain seasons, like you don't really need to train that hard. You need to tell your body that it wasn't good enough so that it maintains the strength to be better, which doesn't take that long to do. And then you need to be generally active. So, get up and walk around. And if your work is mainly at a desk, then get a standing desk and go for walks during the day, like that kind of stuff. And then when you do work out, you don't need to spend hours in the gym. You really just need enough time to, again, tell your muscles they weren't good enough, which could just be one set to failure of a push, a pull, and a leg exercise. And there's research that shows that that's just as good as spending hours in the gym. For the average person. You don't really need much more than that. And it's better to do that outside rather than inside. But people can do the best they can, I just think that there's kind of this, I think there's because of the poor advice we've gotten in the past about health, there's this overemphasis on diet and exercise. And those things are important, right? What you eat and how you move your body and how much you move your body is very important. But it's not the only thing that will keep you healthy. You need more than that. And if you do the other things that are more, then those diet and exercise type things become less important. Still important, all part of this complex thing that creates health. But you don't need to spend hours in the gym if you are eating a whole foods diet and grounding and getting sunlight and things like that. And if you just like muscle mass is the important thing. Like muscle mass is the number one indicator of longevity. So if you maintain your muscle mass as you age, you are very likely to live longer than if you didn't. So all you got to do is get enough animal protein and challenge your muscles a few times a week, and you will maintain that muscle mass pretty effectively. There's a really good book by Dr. Doug McGuff named Body by Science that talks a lot about that, about how you can with very minimal time. So people who have less time can get the same benefits as spending hours in the gym. So
good to know. And since we are on the topic of muscle and heart being one, I wanted to ask you to share a little bit of your input here on something I read in your book that I actually found very interesting, that was something I think our audience could benefit from. Could you tell us the difference, or rather, what is correct, the heart pumping or the heart beating? I know you have an opinion on that.
Yeah, so definitely the heart beating, contracting, rather than the heart pumping. So the heart is not really there to pump blood. We've already talked about how blood can move with structured water mechanisms in the artery. And the heart does do a little bit of pumping, but no more than enough to move the blood through the chambers of the heart itself. After that, these mechanisms in the artery are what takes over and keeps the blood moving. And there's more than just those. There's also things like paramagnetism and electrostatic properties and things like that. But the main way is the structured water in the arteries moving the blood. So the heart is it's contracting for a reason. So if you look at the muscles of the heart, or it's just actually one big band of muscle that's wrapped up on itself. And so they're oriented in a spiral-like nature. So when it contracts, it spirals like this. And so that vortexes the blood, kind of swishes it around. And when water, because the blood is about half water, gets swished around, just like it's flowing in a river or coming out of a spring, it actually gets more energized. So the same thing happens if you put infrared light on water. It gets more energized, and that builds the structured water. So this heart contracting and vortexing is actually energizing the blood so that when it gets into the arteries, it can structure itself better. Although if we rely just on the heart to do that, it's not going to be enough. So that's why we have to get the infrared light from outside as well, and the grounding and things like that. And so if the heart's not contracting or not pumping, its job is to swish the blood around. That's one reason the heart is there. The second reason the heart is there is because it maintains the pressure between the arteries and the veins. Because if we do exercise, all the blood would rush over to the arterial side, delivering oxygen and nutrients to tissues. And if the heart wasn't there to actually slow the flow of blood, and they've actually shown this in endurance athletes and soccer players, they've shown that the heart slows the flow of blood during exertion to maintain the pressure between two systems. Because if it didn't, the venous side would collapse and we would die, which would not be a good thing. And then the third reason the heart is there is because the heart has the biggest electromagnetic field of any organ in the body. It's 5,000 times stronger than the brain's. And it's the only electromagnetic field that is large enough to be able to detect all the cells in the body. So it's kind of monitoring all the cells in the body, which this goes back to coherence. It's measuring how well everything is communicating in the body so that the heart can pick up that signal, our coherent signal, and relay it to the brain. So that's why heart rate variability, we measure the stress response coherence through the heart, because the heart is the organ that's kind of monitoring the body and picking up. It's very in tune with our intercommunication between a system, but also our emotional state, which is why we say things like, I love you with all my heart. We don't say, I love you with all my liver, or things like that. Or we say, we gave it all our heart. There's this very emotional connection to this organ. And so yeah, like that's the three reasons the heart is there. It's not to forcefully pump blood around the body. And there's studies that show that it's impossible for a heart that size to be able to forcefully move the blood throughout the entire body. There are many other ways blood moves, and the heart has different purposes for being there. So it's pretty fascinating.
If there were three things, lifestyle habits, that you could invite our listener to let go of or consider letting go of to keep loving their hearts, and to use your beautiful words, and keep that heartbeat strong, what would those be?
I would say let go of artificial light at night. Yes, that makes things more convenient. We can keep working late into the evening, but let go of it, or at least block it, to minimize the damaging effects that it has on you. That one for sure. Get rid of processed food and eat whole foods. There's many different diet theories out there and lots of diet dogma, but in general, just get rid of the processed food. No grains, no sugars, no vegetable oils, because that's going to do two things for you. One, it's going to make you eat more whole foods, hopefully sending your diet around animal foods, but also the amount of toxins that come in processed foods, you're going to eliminate that exposure as well. And then let go of preconceived notions, I'll say, because there's a lot of misinformation and things that we know are quote unquote true that end up being hyper realities, things that we take as being more real than what's actually real. And I think that it's very important to understand that there are a lot of things that are thrown in front of our face today that are not actually real. Like there's artificial light. That's not anything like the real light from the sun. There's artificial food. There's artificial relationships. Like there's things that are being thrown, and we take those things as more real sometimes than what's actually real, what life has known for the entire time life has been on planet. So get rid of preconceived notions and things that you think are true, and just open your mind. And because you'll be very surprised at what you find and the revelations that you have when you open your mind to these new ideas, as crazy as they might sound, because sometimes they are crazy and they end up being crazy, right? But if you're never open to them, you never find that out. You just kind of push it away. You don't learn from it. Or there's things that I've read a long time ago, and I was like, that's stupid. That's insane. I'm not doing that. But then I read and keep reading and stay curious. And I'm like, oh, maybe that thing I read a while back wasn't so crazy. Now it makes a lot more sense based on these other things. So just kind of stay open to that and be curious and get rid of those preconceived notions and things that we're told, and start exploring, I guess.
I'm so grateful, Dr. Hussey. I've learned so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and considering how much we know about gratitude and its impact on our hearts, I just really want to close this episode off with my most sincere gratitude towards you. And I'm sure our listeners will join in to feel that gratitude to you and to all that we've learned. How can our listeners connect with you and your extraordinary work and your book, which we will include in the show notes? Anywhere else you want our listener to connect with you?
For sure. Well, first, I'll extend gratitude to you for the opportunity to come and share my message, for sure. But my website is resourceyourhealth.com. And that's where people can find like my recommended products, and my health coaching is on there. And then I have a few books, and they're on there as well. And then I'm on social media. My handle is just Dr. Stephen Hussey, Dr. Stephen Hussey, Instagram and Facebook and Twitter, or X, I guess it's called now. And people can reach out to me there too. Just reach out.
We appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Hussey. And we speak again very soon, I'm sure. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you for spending your time with me today and listening to this episode. Remember to subscribe so that you can receive weekly updates. And if today's message resonated with you, please remember to share it with a friend, a colleague, or a loved one who could really benefit from this episode.